Hey there my fellow witches, Hazel here with the Magical Den channel. If you are a beginner and stepping into the path of paganism, Wicca, or witchcraft, or you simply being drawn down this path, then you have made it to the right channel where you will find helpful knowledge about the craft, its rituals, tips and tricks. In today's video we will be discussing the history of witches. The earliest witches we know of are those who were known to practice witchcraft. They cast off enchanted incantations and called upon their higher power spirits to help them solve a problem or to bring about change to a situation. Most of the time, witches were just seen as pagans who were worshipping the devil and doing spells to do the devil's work for him in the human world. Many witches, as well as pagan, were actually not doing anything at all like that. They were simply trying to be natural healers and were referred to as the wise women who were simply misunderstood for their chosen profession. Most witches who are true to their nature are not evil at all. They simply feel a deeper connection to the spirit world as well as nature, and they use this connection to help rectify situations that have gone wrong, or to bring about the spirit's power to make a negative situation a more positive one. Early witches were seen to be truly horrific people and were often avoided by those who did not practice witchcraft. Usually, witches kept to themselves to avoid the unwanted attention, and that's how covens came about, so that they had a group of like-minded people who they could worship with and not be judged for their practices. It is not exactly clear when witches first came on the scene in our history, but there is one of the initial archives of a witch. It is in the Bible in the book of 1 Samuel, which was believed to have been printed between 931 BC and 721 BC. This idea that was written in the Bible tells of King Saul when he went and sought out the Witch of Endor to help him beckon the dead fortune-teller Samuel's soul so that he could get the help he needed to defeat the Philistine army. Even in times as old as these, witches were used to help others out in times of need when they were not strong enough to do it on their own. It also shows witches in a positive light, which is interesting because of all of the negative press they had gotten years after. The witch had the ability in this story to rouse Samuel, who then had the opportunity to prophase that Saul and his lads would expire. The following daytime, rendering to the story that was told in the Bible, Saul's sons both perished in battle and Saul was told to have committed suicide. It is interesting that this is the story that was first discovered about witches because they are shown as someone who can resurrect the dead, which is not something that is commonly done by witches. This is just typically a myth of the religion, and not many Wiccans or witches for that matter are able to do such thing, and even if they were, typically they advise against it because of the bad things that can come along with it. Witches typically live by a rule that they should not mess with the natural course of life, so bringing someone back from the dead can only mean that something else has to happen in order to keep the universe in balance. However, there are other Old Testament verses within the Bible that convict witches, such as the often talked about Exodus 22 verse 18, which speaks, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." There are other instances in the Bible to which it heeds a warning when it comes to witches and the powers that they possess. The additional verse in the Bible caution against divination, chanting or using witches to contact those who have already died and are gone beyond the earth. This shows the earliest times of the Bible as seeing witches negatively as well, so the story from above can be seen both as a positive thing and a negative one depending on how you look at it. This is probably why those who were condemning witches in the early years took this approach, because many people were Christian at that time and advised against any such religion that was not of the same faith. Witches stirred a lot of controversies because they did not believe in the Christian God like so many others did at that time. It is important to note that even if you are of a different religion, everyone should be accepted as well as their beliefs. With this being the oldest written record of any such type of witches, the next history marker of witch history would likely be the hysteria that took over Europe during the mid-1400s. This hysteria was brought on by a writing known as Malleus Maleficarum. This was a time in our history that everyone was accusing everyone of being a witch. When many of the suspect witches admitted, it was frequently under torment. They likely confessed to a diversity of wicked performances that they were not even guilty of partaking in. Within the next century, witch hunts became the new normal, and most of the people who were accused of being witches, many who had not confessed to any wrongdoing, were executed by either being burned at the stake, or they were hung in the town square for public executions. This scene is one that is widely depicted in all of the stories and movies we have today in the early history of witches. The Salem witch trials were absolutely the most popular of that time, as Salem was known to be the headquarters for most of the witches that were around at that time. There were so many people being accused of witches in that town and during that time that they were holding public executions on the regular. This is an interesting point in our history because usually when there is a group such as witches who threaten the way of life that people enjoy, they are often punished in the most public and critical ways. Since then we have obviously grown from this and have become more accepted, but we should all learn the history of witches because so that we can take the opportunity to build a better future. Between 1500 and 1660, there were up to 80,000 different people who were suspected of being witches and were eventually put to death during these years. More often than not, those that were accused of being witches were women, and hardly any men, although some were accused. Around 80% of the female population was accused and were supposed to be working with the devil and filled with desire and other undignified emotions. Within Europe, Germany had the uppermost witchcraft execution amount, while Ireland was known to have the lowest. Although the Salem witch trials happened in the United States, it was also known to have a high rate of execution, especially for just one town inside of an entire country. What we learn from this information is that the more populated an area was, the more accusations they had of people being involved in witchcraft. It was commonplace for women to be the most accused because at that time it was not really popular for men to be known to dabble in witchcraft or performing spells. This type of behavior was often accused of women who lead a more promiscuous lifestyle at that time. With the Book of Malleus Maleficarum, which was printed by two very well-respected German Dominicans in the year 1486, this was known to have been the starting point of the stirred witch mania to go viral across many different countries. The book was written as the guidelines for someone to be able to identify a witch, hunt a witch, and also interrogate them into admitted of the witch activities. This probably spurred this hysteria because many people would read the book and determine that all of their friends and neighbors had the same characteristics as the witches described in the publication, and therefore they would go on a rampage accusing everyone of being a witch because of it. The mass hysteria that was caused was so detrimental, and no one was honestly safe from being accused of being a witch during this time. The mass hysteria started in Europe before it made its way to the New World. This publication was known to have labeled witchcraft as heresy, as that it was not necessarily true. This also rapidly developed as the expert for both Protestants and Catholics in their regions to begin to try to flush out witches that could possibly be living among them, and they just do not know who it was. For more than what seemed like 100 years, the book retailed more reproductions than any other book in Europe other than the Bible. It was so widely popular that it was continued to be in print for a very long time, was translated into a lot of different languages, which added to the widespread ideology of the witch trials and executions. It was definitely a crazy time in our history to be alive and living in. To cover more information about the Salem witch trials in the New World, it became a phenomenon here as the hysteria about witches began to die down in Europe. The Salem witch trials are one of the most well-known trials to take place in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. There are so many books and writings and movies about this time in our history that many did not even realize that it actually started in Europe many years earlier. The Salem witch trials were known to have begun when two girls became extremely ill. They demanded to be witches and were suspected by many of their fellow citizens of practicing and meddling in witchcraft. Ultimately, during the entire length of the Salem witch trials, 150 were accused of being witches and practicing magic, and 18 of those 150 were actually put to death. When the 300th anniversary of the Salem witch trials came around, there was an event held in 1992 to honor the dead of the trials, as a park was devoted in Salem and a dedicatory was held in Danvers, a nearby town. In 2016, the University of Virginia announced a new project called the Gallows Hill Project, which was a team of people who were determining the exact execution place in Salem, where 19 of the witches were hanged. The town owns the place of the hangings, and they are establishing a commemorative site for the dead. Massachusetts was not the first of the original 13 colonies that were obsessed with the idea of witches, however. In the city of Windsor, which was located in the state of Connecticut in the year 1647, Elise Young was one of the first people in America who was accused and executed for being involved in witchcraft. Before the final execution in Connecticut was conducted in 1697, 46 persons were suspected of sorcery in the state, and 11 of those people were put to death for the crime. This information shows us how easy it was for the hysteria of witches to spread through the colonies of the New World. Many were affected, some more than others. While Massachusetts is the most well-known, places like Connecticut as well as Virginia saw their own fair share of accusations that lead people to their death along with social annihilation and many other things. In Virginia, people were known to be far less frantic about the idea of their family members and neighbors being witches and practicing magic. In fact, in Lower Norfolk County in the year 1655 a law was approved making it delinquency to incorrectly blame someone for sorcery without having any proof of the fact that they were actually practicing magic. Still, though witchcraft was definitely a concern for this population, but at least the law stopped any mass hysteria among the people, saving a lot of innocent people from getting executed for something they may not have had any part of. Out of all of the witch trials that happened in the New World, about 24 of them took place in Virginia, and many of them were for women between the years 1626 and 1730. Although many of these women were accused, none of them were actually executed for the crimes in which they were accused. One of the most famous witches of the time was Grace Sherwood, who lived in Virginia. She was accused by her neighbors of killing their pigs and putting hexes on their cotton crops. When more and more accusations were brought upon her, she was eventually brought to trial for witchcraft in 1706. While the trial proceeded, the court decided to use a test of the water, which at that time was very controversial, to determine whether or not she was guilty. Her arms and legs were tied and then she was tossed into the river. This test determined that if she sank she was acquitted and if she hovered she was guilty of the crime. Once she was thrown into the water, she did not sink, and therefore she was considered guilty and was sentenced to being a witch. Although she was not murdered for her accusations, they did however throw her in jail, and she was in there for 8 years. As you can see, each state in the New World took their own approach to their witch trials. While many were extreme, not all of them took part in the executions of those that were accused of being witches. There was also an ironic article that was allegedly inscribed by former President Benjamin Franklin about a witch trial that took place in New Jersey. The article was printed in 1730 in the local paper at the time known as the Pennsylvania Gazette. This article that was written brought light to the ridiculousness of some of the accusations that came about of people practicing in witchcraft. After this article was published, whether it had some influence or not, it did not take long for the mania to die down regarding accusing neighbors and friends of being witches. There were many laws eventually passed in the New World that helped persons from being incorrectly suspect and sentenced to crimes they did not commit. These laws were the protection that a lot of people needed so they did not get executed during the trials, or that they helped keep people from looking at one another in an accusatory way. Even today, a lot of modern-day witches have a really hard time shaking the historical stereotype away from what they are trying to accomplish through their worship and rituals. Many witches in today's age practice Wicca, which is now accepted as an official religion in both the United States and Canada. Wiccans, as we know, evade wicked and the arrival of evil at all costs. The motto they uphold stand for damage nobody, and they all strive to live non-violent and stable lives that are accepting and in tune with what nature delivers to humankind. Current-day witches are still known to practice witchcraft, but there rarely is anything that can be considered menacing about it. Their spells and chants that they perform are often from the Book of Shadows, which is a 20th century gathering of the understanding of sorcery and can be likened to the act of a prayer in other faiths. Thank you so much for listening. Always remember that knowledge is power. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you will be notified of the next upcoming video, and as always, brightest blessings to my fellow witches.